Let me now turn to some of the challenges around scaling up and challenges of rolling out the process. And being a social science institution, we've tried to look at the intersection between the social, the technological, the environmental. I'm going to focus now in terms of looking at socio-technical dynamics and the challenges. The whole issue of the quality of spread versus the challenge of maximizing impact. And often when it goes to scale very rapidly, quality may be compromised. The whole question of what actually happens to the poorest, to women, to other groups. Is there inclusion? Wider questions of sustainability and also issues of scaling up. What we tried to do, and this is work done particularly by Sinamovic, was to try and look at the intersection between the social, the technological, and the ecological when we're looking at how CLTS is rolled out on the ground and also trying to understand its dynamics. And we often found that these dimensions, how they intersect, are often neglected because in the rush to get things right, to roll it out, to meet targets, one can actually lose sight of many of these dimensions. So let's just look at some of them briefly. So when we talk about the social, obviously the group characteristics matter, and whether a community is homogeneous or heterogeneous. If it's homogeneous, success maybe, is more likely to happen. So obviously here we have to look at what's happening in the community. Community-led total sanitation is going to build on existing power relations, gender relations, cultural norms. In some societies, shit can be used out in the fields, in China, for example. In other societies, it can't be done. In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, daughters-in-law can't use the same toilets as fathers-in-law, so you would have to build 2 separate latrines or toilets to get this program to work. So you really need to know this. The role of religion is critical. In Islam, the imams have played a very, very key role in highlighting notions of cleanliness, and that's why CLTS has worked very often in Muslim countries and societies more than other places. So all these issues really matter. And then the historical trajectory of sanitation and the sanitation program in a country. If, for example, there wasn't a very well-entrenched system in place, they're more likely to adopt CLTS, for example, in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as opposed to India, which has had decades and decades of sanitation policies and programs. So if we're looking at the technological dimension here, what kind of, are we talking about allowing local people to draw on different innovation, use their own material, build their own toilets, or are we being rather top-down and prescriptive in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure? So all that is really going to matter. And finally, the ecological dimension is really critical, and this dimension is often neglected. So obviously toilets, lots and lots of them, are built now in the landscape. And whether they're sustainable or not will depend on soil and moisture conditions, will depend on issues such as floods and droughts. The impact on the groundwater table can also take place. Sometimes there can be contamination, presence of pathogens in the environment. And these issues are sometimes very neglected in CLTS. So let me now just turn to some of the dimensions that are critical. So there's a huge diversity. It's been rolled out in 60 countries. And when CLTS is done in a bottom-up way, it encourages for lots and lots of local ownership and innovation. So people start at the bottom of the sanitation ladder. They build very, very simple toilets like the one you see on the left. And they slowly move up. And you can see the pride that this gentleman here in Bangladesh has in the toilet that he has just built. And the idea is that you're supposed to move up the sanitation ladder gradually. Now, whether that happens or not is another question. So when it's more bottom-up, it's more likely to work, as opposed to when there is one solution, one hardware solution. For example, in India, that's often the case, which provides a prescribed design. That tends to be much more top-down. There are further institutional dimensions around scaling up. In many countries, in the rush to meet targets, ambitious targets are laid out for districts, for villages, for regions, and there are incentives that are offered. For example, prizes that are offered to communities if they achieve ODF status. ODF refers to open defecation-free status. Now, some of this can be very counterproductive. India is a good case in point where you have a big rollout of this prize, and often a sort of exaggerated notion of success, and then millions and millions of missing toilets as opposed to actually people that use them, because a lot of money is then lost in hardware, in corruption, etc. Now, this is a picture in Bangladesh of a ring slab that was given out, doled out to communities, and it's not being used at all, as you can see. So if you're really doling things out in this way, there is going to be a sustainability issue. There is going to be a lack of buy-in. Inclusion and exclusion is a major, major issue. And the dimension of subsidy is critical. Community-led total sanitation, CLTS, sometimes may have a slightly naive view of the community, the idea that because the community and everybody wants to achieve open defecation-free status, the rich will help the poor, that there'll be general buy-in and everybody will start using the toilet. Now, obviously, life is more complicated than that. Sometimes the poorest can be left out, or they could build the toilets, they could begin, but then there could be a crisis, there could be seasonal hunger, there could be an issue, and they may revert back to open defecation. So really, making sure that the poor stay on board, that they're included, is a critical issue. And often some people may choose to be open defecators by choice because they don't want to use the toilets, but often it could be just because of structural issues around poverty, around exclusion. The gender issue is very, very critical. CLTS has been amazing in the way it has mobilized women, even in societies where women are traditionally secluded, to become quote-unquote natural leaders. So women in many, many communities have become very, very powerful agents of change. They've been the sort of barefoot workers who've rolled out CLTs. Here you see a woman in Bangladesh building her own toilet. But obviously there are many gender dimensions around the issue that need to be taken into account. And it's one thing to have women who are leaders, but on a day-to-day basis, are women really being consulted adequately? Who is actually cleaning the toilet? Invariably, it's women, so this could add to their already extended day because women are doing a lot in rural areas as it is. There's a whole issue of whether there's enough water for the toilets, who's going to fetch the water. So I guess there are lots of gender dimensions that are often neglected. There is a wider sustainability issue. For example, there's a toilet there at the back and there is a water pump there. There's all sorts of questions about whether contamination is taking place. Maybe it's, in some places it may, in some places it may not. A lot depends on local conditions, on local soil and moisture conditions, as I pointed out. But these dimensions are often neglected when these toilets are being sunk and built all over. A dimension that is very critical, that is often neglected, is actually what happens to the shit. So this is in Haryana in India. People often do not want to build pit latrines, so they want to go straight to a permanent structure like that. And then where does the water and the shit go to? There's not necessarily any proper sewage, so you really have to think of what's happening to the waste. Now, in rural areas, this may not be a critical issue because you could actually think of ways of containing the shit one way or the other, though it's not really happening in this village, where all the wastewater is being drained somewhere, so you just wonder what's happening. In urban areas, there's clearly a challenge about what to do with the waste, what to do with the shit. And this is a serious challenge that I think really needs to be addressed in CLTS and also in sanitation more generally. And finally, technology does matter. What kind of technology do you employ will also depend on its sustainability. Now, this is probably fixed point open defecation. This is in Ethiopia, where people are just shitting in a hole. When you start putting some technology in, whether it's simple, whether it's complicated, I've already spoken about the technological dimensions, and that in it will also impact on wider sustainability issues. So what I've shown is that CLTS is a very powerful case of local innovation. It has really challenged conventional mindsets regarding financing, regarding subsidies and the role of communities. Where it has departed from traditional sanitation programs, it has seen people as agents of change rather than institutions, things or bureaucracies. So in that sense, it's been quite incredible. There's been a rapid spread and scaling up of CLTS. In these last 14 years, we're talking about 60 countries, massive uptake in several official sanitation policies, etc. So it's scaled up very rapidly, and the scaling up process has been quite different from country to country, and it's scaled up through process and people. But what you have to think about is that in the push for maximizing impact and going to scale, this can sometimes compromise on quality, on the quality of CLTS, on the quality of facilitation, on issues concerning wider sustainability, and here I'm referring to institutional sustainability, social dimensions of sustainability, the technological, the financial dimensions, as well as issues concerning the inclusion of the poorest. CLTS, for it to work, obviously you need the right balance between the role of the state, between donors, the NGOs, as well local government, as well as the buy-in of local communities. CLTS definitely can and has a huge role to play in rolling out the right to sanitation and people's citizenship rights around sanitation. But there are questions that could be asked about, whether we're depending too much on local citizens to deliver. In many countries, you take these things for granted. You take toilets for granted, you take water for granted. And in some ways, there's a huge disparity in that sense around the world. And there are wider lessons from history. 1858 was the Great Stink in the UK. There was a major anniversary a few years back, the 150 years of the Great Stink. What lessons have we learned? I mean, even in Europe, it took decades and decades to get it right before there was universal access to sanitation. And I guess we all want this universal access to happen. It's a dream. CLTS is playing quite a huge role in it. But there are several challenges around the way. And I hope this little talk has highlighted some of them. Thanks.